I suppose that you could reasonably argue that every sermon might begin with the preacher asking the audience for the gift of their patience, but today it seems especially imperative that I ask you, my listeners, to make a generous and conscious decision right now to stick with me to the end. What may not seem to make much sense initially, I hope, will all be revealed in the end. Ironically, I must begin just now by asking for a gift of your time. I'd like to start with one of my favorite quotes from the Buddhist philosopher Alan Watts, who said that no carpenter ever claimed to not be able to finish a construction job because he had run out of inches. Inches, meters, cubits, acres, hectares, miles are simply units of measure. These words have meaning because we use them in our daily lives, and they're very useful to us, like knowing the difference when working on a recipe, whether that's a cup of sugar or a ton of sugar. I can say that feet and meters don't exist, but we know what it means when we say that we need 6 feet of lumber, or that people who live up north might get a meter of snow. Lumber exists. Snow exists. Thankfully, it doesn't exist where I live, but I've seen it, and I know that it exists. I'm sure that you don't need any further argument to prove this point. We can all quickly agree that units of measure are merely useful, albeit entirely contrived things. What may take more evidence is the claim I hope to convince you of today, which is that time, like inches, is just a unit of measure, but it does not, in and of itself, exist. Many of us will be engaged in a number of different rituals this evening to mark the ending of one year and the beginning of a new year. Most of us know that even though most of the world now agrees on a 12-month calendar year that begins on January 1, and even those who prefer to mark time differently still typically have to at least be aware of the popular agreement on January 1. Buddhists in Thailand would tell you that the current year is 2566, and many Muslims would tell you that the year is 1445, both basing their calendar year on the presumed time of their presumed founding prophets, but the whole thing is still based on nothing more than general agreement. Our current calendar is the end result of centuries of political and religious beliefs and traditions that now have us starting a year not at some logical point like winter solstice or spring equinox, but rather a nearly arbitrary point in early winter. Our 7-day week is similarly arbitrary, and our division of 12 months in a year is terribly odd, since one of those months only has 28 days, while 4 have 30 days and 7 have 31. Nothing would make more sense than to give February a couple more days so that we would have 7 months with 30 days and 5 with 31. But no matter how logical that change would be, it'll never happen because making the change itself would be so confusing that people would never catch up. We have, in our way of measuring time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, but not 60 hours in a day. We have 24 hours in a day, 12 in the morning, 12 in the afternoon and evening. All of this is based on a 12 base of counting rather than 10, like almost everything else we do. Wouldn't it make more sense if we had 10 seconds in a minute, 10 minutes in an hour, and 10 hours in a day? But again, tradition dictates these imaginary measurements, and we're not likely to ever bring them into any kind of logical conformity. These fixtures of measurement are so pervasive in our language and our technology that they begin to take on a life of their own, as if we were describing something that was real, which I insist they are not. Boiled down to the most simple concept, what our units of time actually measure is movement. The earth revolves on its axis once, and that is a day. That's 24 hours. The earth revolves around the sun, or so it seems, and that is a year. The sun is actually in motion, so we're rotating in a constant spiral while we chase our star through the galaxy. But what if the earth stopped spinning? What if our solar system stopped being in motion? What if people and plants and the very atoms that make up our planet and our bodies, what if they stopped moving altogether? What then would be the passage of time? Wouldn't we say about such a state of affairs that time is frozen? Because the only meaningful dimension of time is movement. Time does not exist, but matter, actual things, change their position in relation to one another, and that is a measurement of movement. To quote Stephen Hawking, Einstein's general theory of relativity on its own predicted that space-time began at the Big Bang singularity and would come to an end at the crunch singularity. That is, without matter that is in motion, there is no time. Einstein and Hawking both talk about the fabric of time bending under certain circumstances, but if I may be allowed to punch way over my head for a moment, what they're really saying is that the faster that any material thing travels, the more the atoms in that material thing slow down. Whether it's a clock or a person, they slow down and they get heavier and they get more dense. So they appear to be moving slower in time. If you have identical clocks, put one on the surface of the earth and put the other in a rocket circling the earth, the one on the surface will appear to move forward in time faster than the one that's in space. But men and women, clocks are not time. Clocks are mechanical objects that we use to measure time based on certain assumptions of their mechanics. But motion changes the nature of the mechanics. The faster something moves, the slower atoms within it change position. But the concept of time is rooted so deeply in our minds that we've come to think of it as being more like a river that flows continually in one direction. And in that way, we mortals are like little paper boats that are just at our birth dropped into the river, and we travel along at the same speed as all the other paper boats in the river around us until each individual one gets waterlogged and sinks. In modern times, this concept of time as a river has inspired some to wonder if they might somehow put a propeller on their boat and move forward in time, or turn around and motor back upstream into the past. The notion of time travel began to appear in fiction literature in the 18th century. But in the 19th century, the idea caught on, so we got things like the story of Rip Van Winkle or The Christmas Carol, and famously H.G. Wells' novel The Time Machine. Even Mark Twain tried his hand at it when he wrote a time travel piece called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. But I'd like to make a distinction in literature between fiction and fantasy. This distinction may really only be necessary for this present topic, but it seems important to me to point out that there are fictions which describe events that could have happened, may happen, or may have happened, but there are fictions which are pure fantasy. imagination untethered from any responsibility to reality. Star Trek, for example, is famous for having predicted a number of things that were actually invented later on, such as tablet computers, voice interactive computer software, instantaneous translators, transparent aluminum, flip phones, and pen communicators. On one level, science fiction can look at what is being developed in science and engineering and make predictions of how those things may actually find a place in our lives in history. Science fiction often suffers from excesses of enthusiasm, such as Marty McFly's hoverboard in a Back to the Future movie that was set in 2015. We're past that point by several years, and we still don't really have hoverboards. The Jetsons, with their flying cars and domestic robots, was set in 2062, and I fear that they will also fail to meet those predictions. But hoverboards, flying cars, domestic robots, they're possible and can be realistically discussed with existing science in mind. Such things are properly what I'm calling science fiction. On the other hand, in order to make many fiction stories work, to make the plot line flow, they also have to inject a number of things that are pure fantasy. Fantasy necessary to the plot, but not at all possible. Like, for example, the warp drive in Star Trek or hyperspace in Star Wars. This is the crux of why I'm taking on this topic today. Our language seduces us and makes it difficult for us to tell the difference between what is possible and what is pure fantasy. What I find to be the most frustrating is when people confuse the mere fact that they find a certain aspect of fantasy to be thrilling or so exciting that they want it to be true, that literally, as we existentialists often say, it pleases me to think so. It pleases them to believe that traveling faster than the speed of light is possible. It pleases them to think that there's a multi-dimensional universe. It pleases them to think that we could travel through wormholes and in so doing navigate our way backwards in time or to other parts of the universe. And that, I submit, is not simply a matter of personal belief. It is a matter of choosing to embrace delusion. It's bad for science. It's bad for literature. It's bad for politics. And folks, it's bad for religion. You have to know that. A key element of critical thinking is the ability to divide the possible from the impossible. Holding on to delusions is choosing to be unintelligent. Once you abandon a devotion to reality, then all manner of insanity is put on the same level of credibility with actual rational thinking. Believing that there is intelligent life on other planets in the universe doesn't require too much of a stretch. The universe is very big, and there are a lot of planetary systems which seem to have the right parameters to support the evolution of life as we understand it. However, the distance between these planets is so great that there is no way that we're going to go to brunch together. The closest of these planetary systems that could possibly support life is about 25 trillion miles away. It takes light 4 years to get there from here. The popular astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson seems to take a good deal of delight in teasing TV interviewers on this topic, wondering aloud why alien spacecraft only seem to appear to military pilots. And he has asked why their images of photographs that they take of these things are always so fuzzy. Tyson wonders, maybe aliens are fuzzy. And why, with 6 billion cell phones on the planet, has no one ever taken a decent picture of an alien or a UFO? Tyson, like me, accepts that intelligent life probably exists all over the universe. But he also insists that the distances between planets is such that we are never going to meet them. The speed of light is a constant. So far as we know, it is impossible for anything to go faster. And yes, I know that there are theoretical aspects of physics in which it's discussed that maybe at the edges of an expanding universe, something is moving faster than the speed of light. But here on Earth 1, we are aware that we can't even approach light speed because the closer you get to light speed, the more energy is required to accelerate, and it quickly gets to what physicists call simply infinite energy. That is, plainly, you can't get there from here. The faster you move, the more atomic movement slows down. So, should an astronaut be able to travel at nearly the speed of light towards Proxima Centauri, even though it took said astronaut 4 years to get there, it would have only felt like a few minutes. However, because mass condenses the faster you go, the astronaut would have been crushed to the point of being smaller than a pea. You might not have many wrinkles left, but you would have gained an infinite amount of weight. So giving up on traveling at light speed, what if we just tried to go really, really fast? Odd things happen in physics even when we go much less than light speed. For example, if we could travel at 20% of light speed, then the movement of hydrogen atoms would become like bullets. If you were in a spaceship traveling at 20% the speed of light, it would feel like you were being shot with 1,000 machine guns. Because of these very real limitations of human space travel, science fiction becomes fantasy, with talk about wormholes and hyperdrives and warp engines or even multi-dimensional universes. Wormholes may theoretically exist, but if they do, they exist for very brief moments. But even if we could catch one in formation, you couldn't go through the wormhole because you would immediately be crushed to smaller than a pea, and then when the wormhole disintegrates, which they do very quickly, you would be torn to shreds. Traveling through a wormhole is about as scientific as Harry Potter's magic wand. These are matters of fantasy, of conjecture and Hollywood, but not rational thought. Again, you can find any number of theorists who very intelligently discuss many of the what-ifs of physics. If, for example, a kind of antimatter, which does not exist in any way that we know of, actually did exist, if what isn't was, then you might be able to stabilize a wormhole in space for a while, but you still couldn't go through it. My point is, pieces of theoretical physics, which are fun to think about and talk about, do not always add up to an intelligent whole. Good for fantasy movies, bad for rational conversation. If you are still not convinced, if you believe that the evidence exists but it's being kept classified by the government, then please consider this. When in 2017 Donald Trump became president and had access to all of our nation's secrets, do you believe that he went out to Area 51, saw the crashed alien spaceship and the dead alien astronauts, and didn't tell anyone about it? That stretches credulity quite a bit, doesn't it? That would make it easier to believe in magic. But a bit more back on topic. Theoretically, even though we cannot literally travel forward in time, because speed slows down our atomic motion, if we could travel fast enough, it would feel like we had traveled forward in time. But to travel backwards in time, to do that would require every single atom in that river of time to immediately and simultaneously and accurately move backwards, retrace its movement. Literally, the entire universe suddenly going into reverse. That is, you would have to make all matter everywhere retrace its atomic path, which presumably would include the atoms that make up my body, which means that I would age backwards until I didn't exist anymore. Obviously, people, this is impossible. Both Einstein and Hawking jokingly reference the grandfather paradox that speculates that you mustn't go back in time and kill your own grandfather because it would snuff out your own existence. But they don't mention that as a real possibility. Both Einstein and Hawking had a sense of humor, even though many of their modern readers apparently don't. When the comedian Dennis Miller talks about performing in a comedy club in Birmingham, Alabama, called I Don't Get It, that doesn't mean that there's actually a comedy club in Birmingham by that name, but it does mean that Miller has some general opinions about the sophistication of the people in Alabama. But if you're looking up the address for a comedy club there named I Don't Get It, well, you might be from Alabama. For anyone who has had difficulty following me up to this point, please just accept this shorthand observation. We know that you can't travel back in time because no one from the future has ever traveled back to our time. And please don't believe anything that you see on the History Channel. As one of my physics professors said, the only people who talk knowingly about visits from aliens appear to cite government sources, and the government only talks about aliens when things here on Earth 1 are not going well. She may have been promoting a conspiracy theory of her own, saying that the government is just distracting us with silly rumors about space aliens so that we don't think about the ecology, the economy, or government corruption, but I have to admit, her conspiracy theory seems more plausible than having visitors from other planets. The more that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism cling to myths that clearly are not historically true, the more religion alienates intelligent modern people. There is a great deal about spirituality that could make the world more just, more peaceful, more healthy, but pretending to believe in ghosts and souls and eternal life and angels and demons and magic books is getting in the way of any serious spiritual progress. Our nation is falling behind in such basic skills as science and even math. This is true in part because we have come to believe that believing in delusional things is our right. Yes, you have a right to believe that the Holy Spirit talks to you, or that you've ridden in the Millennium Falcon in hyperspace, and that Scooby-Doo sometimes drives your minivan. But if you insist upon these delusions, you are choosing to be the opposite of smart. Somehow, the ability to suspend reality in favor of imagination has corrupted our politics to such a degree that it has taken our judicial system 3 years after January 6 of 2021 to decide if there really was an insurrection which millions of us watched happening live on TV. And sadly, a lot of us from certain states actually know people who were involved and attempted to overthrow American democracy. They even posted videos of themselves in the Capitol building doing it on their Facebook page. Now, I love science fiction movies or science fantasy movies. I never miss a Marvel or a DC superhero movie. I see the good ones and I see the bad ones. I never miss anything in the Harry Potter franchise, even if the author has a good deal of growing up to do. But I understand such things to be escapism because reality can be exhausting, and sometimes I feel the need to take a break. But folks, let's sharpen our critical thinking skills. Let's be honest with ourselves when we are indulging in reading our horoscope or watching Fox News that we know it isn't real. And we are not going to factor anything from the History Channel into our actual understanding of history. There are important matters at hand, and you and your brain and your talent are needed back here on Earth One.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.